Good evening, everybody. Really pleased to introduce our lecturer this evening. Boy, tough day to lecture, Kai. Not really. Maybe it's apropos, as I will try to point out. First, let's do the logistics. Kai-Uwe Bergmann is a partner at BIG, who brings his expertise to proposals around the globe, including work in North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. He heads up BIG's business development, which of course is Bjarke Ingels Group in Copenhagen, Denmark, working in 20 different countries, as well as overseeing BIG's communications. He's a registered architect in the USA, in 8 different states, and Canada, and he most recently contributed to the resiliency plan Big U, to protect 10 miles of Manhattan's coastline. He is also an educator. He's taught at the University of Pennsylvania, University of Florida, the IE in Madrid, and his alma mater, University of Virginia. He's also on the board of the Van Allen Institute, and he participates on numerous international juries and lectures globally on the work of BIG. We're, of course, familiar with the work of BIG, and as I said, you know, with the election yesterday, I just told Kai that we had an all-school meeting today about it, which many of you attended. And maybe some of the results were surprising to some of us, but maybe it's a good time to reflect on an aspect of the work of BIG that I think is timely. I've always thought of architecture as ultimately an optimistic endeavor. That is to say that we as architects, in order to create change, must maintain a strong level of optimism in what we do, even when faced with times or places or clients or constituencies that seem to be against us. Now, today some of us maybe aren't too optimistic, but in the work of BIG with their team, including Kai-Uwe and led, of course, by Bjarke, they contain a super high level of optimism in their work. That would be one thing that I would say that we could agree on, that there's an energy there, the way the office is run, the way they communicate to the public, their use of Twitter, social media is quite amazing. And I think this resonates with the ideas that they propose. I would say optimism fuels passion, passion fuels work, and work fuels change. I think that is what they're doing, and I'm pleased to have them here. Please join me in welcoming Kai-Uwe Bergmann to SCI-Arc.
All right. So I'm really touched and honored to be here. I'm connected to Los Angeles through my own studies. I studied at UCLA in 91 to 93. And then in an interesting twist of events, I actually was connected to SCI-Arc after that. Through my connections at UCLA, I became a teaching assistant at your Vico Morcote program that no longer exists, but for, I think, a good 15 to 20 years was one of the key kind of foreign study locations. And I had the real privilege of having, I think, about 50 to 60 SCI-Arc students and working with them with 5 instructors. And then there was a beautiful little cafe or restaurant downstairs, and Robert Mangurian, Marianne Ray came over to visit, and they were looking for an assistant to help them on their Atelier Italia summer. And so I managed to finagle that job too, and so extended my stay with SCI-Arc and the tutelage of, can I call you Mango? Is that possible? Mango and Marianne was truly something that I benefit and think about very, very often. So this is just to say you really never know what and when something touches you. It doesn't matter who's president or what country you're living in. It can really happen anywhere and at any time. Just keep your eyes open and be ready for when it actually happens. I'm here tonight to maybe give you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes kind of trip or journey through basically how we think. And I'm going to do so. So here are offices. We have offices, of course, in New York, Copenhagen, and most recently in London. Bjarke has his back to us. He moves around from, so we all sort of a little bit move around from sort of desk to desk with our laptops and get together around different projects. But I wanted to talk about Hot to Cold because it was both an exhibition and a book. Hennessy and Ingels is astutely like right across the street. I just popped over there. The journey that we take and the way that the book is organized is traveling from the hottest regions that we work to the coldest. So we're currently working actually in about 25 different countries with construction projects in 12 of those. And it's interesting to sort of consider or think about how climate actually and site impacts and drives our work. Here you sort of see the kind of extremities. In the 1930s, there was, of course, the famous exhibition at MoMA, the international style, kind of co-curated, Philip Johnson. This was a celebration of modernism where you could build basically the same looking building, a very efficient tower in any country, and basically through machines, humidifiers, air conditioning, heating, you could basically make anything habitable. And it was basically also saying that man, in a way, was able to subvert nature. The same institution had another exhibition called Architecture Without Architects. And here Rudolfsky, the curator, was actually talking about vernacular architecture, architecture that is driven by its site. So that a igloo in Greenland looks and behaves and performs differently because it's trying to retain heat. The city of Sana'a in Yemen looks the way it does and has sort of chimneys for sort of a wind chimney effect to bring cool air from the streets through the buildings and basically cool the city. So we, Big, see ourselves really in the center between these two, where we take the sort of efficiencies and the structural logic of the international style, modernism, but we also think very much about the site specificness and the sensitivity that's needed in vernacular architecture. We call this engineering without engines, the possibility of reimagining being in buildings that are not driven by machines, but are actually thinking about their sites, about the wind angles and roses, and thinking about where daylight comes from so that you can actually work with the forces instead of against them. So let's start. We're gonna, you can sort of always look at the frame of the projects to see where they're located from hot to cold. We're gonna start with our residential project, Coconut Grove in just outside of Miami, downtown. And this is something that's, again, influenced by the kind of South Beach Art Deco, where you have these kind of extended eyebrows over the windows that sort of protect passively against the high noon sun. So you basically, we've cantilevered all of the terraces and made wraparound balconies, again, to create this, what we feel, very local aesthetic, and one that also performs as a shading. And these are two towers that may look like they are actually adjacent and next to each other, but the actuality is that the site is very narrow, and there's a front tower and a back tower. And historically, in this area, when you've built these two towers, the front tower has always had more value or been able to sell itself at a higher price than the back tower. And what we were looking for was, how can we design these two towers? How can we manipulate them in order to kind of make them appear more side by side, more siblings or sisters than sort of, or twins, rather than older and younger? And how can we think about the views out? How can we sort of create a shared ground level that basically ties the entire complex together? And then also one of sort of just generosity. Here we're looking at how to kind of open up and slide the glass doors so that you basically have a complete interconnection between outside and inside. These sloping columns are what basically allows you to have that quality of being side by side. And the sloping columns are, of course, always different on every floor, so they also become kind of family members. It's not like a column that you would sort of traditionally see straight up, straight down, and you sort of, it's white noise, you lose it. This column is something special. It's something that you can sort of call as a member of your family. Then you have the ground level, everything that's sort of a lush landscape that holds everything together. And the question again is something like this actually possible? So I'm really happy to say that they've literally topped out. The first folks are starting to move in, and the completion date is actually December, next month. So we're really looking forward to having kind of our first example of tropical modernism, is what we call it, here in the United States. We're going to stay in a sort of very tropical climate. This is in Taiwan on the eastern coast, Hualien. This is a community, so more of a master plan for folks who basically are retiring. Their families are downsizing, their kids have moved out of the home. They need perhaps some assistance, so there's a hospital included in this. There's assisted living, as well as really reinforcing active lifestyles. So it's a community that when we're looking at it, we see it as kind of a mini ecosystem. So we're also interested in sort of retaining all of the rainwater on the site. We're interested in almost creating sort of microclimates based on evaporative cooling. And when you look at these structures, you may think that they look very, very unique or very, not necessarily following any kind of logic. But literally all of them are based on a grid. The grid also has a double-loaded corridor. We're looking for the width so that you have daylight coming in from both sides with very little spaces that are too deep to not have natural daylight. We're looking at the travel of the sun, the views both in and out, and as I mentioned, this idea that you can start to retain the rainwater in the green roofs and then through evaporation cool the climate actually by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius just within the site. So we also, the living spaces are somewhat smaller than typical, but we've then made communal spaces larger and generous. So here's one of those spaces where you actually then sort of move in and meet your neighbors. Again, the same idea of these sliding glass doors that just sort of open up the inside and to the exterior. We include a lot of sort of running paths and active spaces. There's also a running path in the basement, so if it's raining, they can still be active. And then the rainwater is collected, of course, on the green roofs and the hard surfaces in a sort of retention pond. And the question always is something like this buildable? Here is the kind of the first community center that's now built and is a testing ground for exactly how the green roofs will sort of interact. The phase 1 construction is starting next spring. In Shenzhen, we are designing Shenzhen's natural gas headquarters. Now, what I really have to admire about the Chinese is that they've come to a realization that they cannot build energy plants fast enough for all of the people that are moving into the cities. And in America, energy companies are literally looked at as the more energy that they produce, the more energy that we consume, the better for their shareholders. So there is no desire to actually to save or to think about the resource or where energy is coming from, just the production and selling. Here, the Chinese have actually said we have to reduce the usage because we can no longer meet the demand. So through their tender for this high-rise, the winner was going to be selected as whoever could reduce their energy bill by 30%. And you had to basically prove it through calculations. So we decided to look at this as something that, the biggest issue here is cooling. It's in a very tropical environment. And it's a 200-meter tall tower and a 100-meter tall tower, right on the main thoroughfare next to the convention center. And what we ended up looking at was just the facade. So thinking about, when heat hits a glass curtain wall, the glass curtain wall is heating up. And if the sun actually goes into the building, then the heat is already there. No matter if you have a curtain or roll down protection, it's there. So really the way to start looking at it is actually how do you keep the heat or the sun's rays from entering the building at all. And so we looked at creating the serrated edge where towards the south, the pieces would be opaque and solid, and towards the north, they would be glazed and you could see through them. So when you look actually, when you're sitting in the office space and you're looking out, then you're going to see sort of indirect light as you look out towards the south against all of these sort of veneered facade elements. And as you look north, then it kind of opens up the view to the city. We're also, again, thinking about how to create sort of generous spaces that are, of course, you're going to have the same view wherever you're working, but then perhaps you come to the meeting floor and we basically pull back the facade to allow for more generous views, or the floor that you go to have lunch. Those are, again, spaces that have like larger spaces that you can actually have bigger views. So this is under construction, ready to be completed in the summer of 2017. We're moving to Seoul, Korea, and we have done a lot of work with manufacturers where what we're trying to do is to sort of say, look, louvers, as we know them, have basically been the same for the last, say, 100 years. It's an extruded aluminum. It's basically extruding aluminum through a die, and you can either get louvers either horizontally or vertically. So the question for us was, how could we look at actually the production of louvers in a way where we actually map out how the sun actually travels across the surface of the building that we're designing, and then taking a look at the most optimum position for the louvers, because louvers just being horizontal or just vertical are not working at the most efficient shading. So they're probably 60 to 70% effective. And so by actually finding how we could actually mold or segment these louvers into curved portions, acting almost like your fingerprint, that any building can be positioned on any place on the planet, and the louver footprint or fingerprint would actually be different for every building depending on where it's located. So it's a way to actually personalize your building, even if it's just a kind of a spec office building. And we're developing this in 3 of our projects right now with this sort of exterior applique of solar shading. One of my projects is the Big U, And I'm sure you remember about 3 years ago, this image, this is when the superstorm Sandy rolled through, knocked out light, and caused about $19 billion of damage. First time in 120 years that the subway flooded, and it was just an amazing time to be living there. I basically lived and worked in Sopo, south of Power, for a while. The gray areas, everything that you see there is what flooded. And when we were tasked with the idea of how to protect the city of Manhattan against future sea level rise, we noticed that there were some areas that actually were little pinch points, just sort of topographically, where the flood zone came close to the coastline. And so we thought of a flood protection system that would basically be broken up into those segments. And so we created the big U going from West 57th to East 40th around the Battery. But it's made up of little U's that are protecting all of those different areas. And instead of just, if you think of Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, when you go there, it's pretty sad. The Corps of Engineers got a bunch of money and literally built dikes and flood walls. These are flood walls that are just pure concrete. They're 15 feet high, and they cut the city off of its water. You have no connection to it whatsoever if you're on the ground level. We saw this as a possibility and an advantage of actually asking the city and its citizens, what is it that you've been missing out? What is it? Is it ballparks? Is it safe lighting? Is it more green space? And we basically started to catalog all of the different things that the people were missing to create a flood barrier, which you see in orange, that could be access walkways. It could be a skate ramp, amphitheater, kiosks, or even urban furniture. So when you think about infrastructure, and I think this is an area where you as architects and as students of architects could really do a huge kind of effort in the future, is to open yourself up to thinking about infrastructure projects as a place that architects can actually bring a lot of value to. And when you think of the High Line, any of you guys who've been to New York, you basically have a disused railroad that is a former infrastructure for the city of getting goods from one place to another. And then by just placing a thin park on top of that train infrastructure, it's now the second most visited site in all of New York. And it's got 6 to 7 million people attracted. It's created $2 billion worth of tax revenue for the city every year. It is phenomenal what actually is all around us. And Los Angeles is like the best example of just thinking of different parts of the city and what you can actually do incrementally, almost like acupuncture, to sort of set off some of these things. So up in the upper right, you have a picture of the current condition, the FDR, the social housing, the tennis courts. They're all on one level, and it just sort of floods. And what we're proposing is basically a wall that becomes seating at the tennis courts. It becomes a lot of different things, bike paths and things along the path. And then you have these bridges that weren't there before that connect the city with the park. All of this was really done through an intense effort to meet the people. We work with about 30 different governmental agencies that all have some level of involvement in the park and in the land that we're touching. And we sometimes had to meet with the same groups 2 or 3 times to get their approval. But through that process, we've now managed to actually design, and we're about to start building the first 2.5 miles, so 1/4 of it, and we're starting the design of another 3.5 miles. So within my lifetime, I think we're going to very much complete 6 of the 10 miles, if not all of them, which is just phenomenal. And we're talking about budgets of about $660 million for the first phase and about $900 million for the second phase. What we're looking at here is kind of what it would look like. So it's a little bit of Venice in New York. with the bike path. And here's a short little film that sort of explains it as well.
That was actually why Sandy was so bad, is because of the phase of the moon. It was already a very large high tide, as well as the storm surge coming in with the wind and the tide lining up perfectly to give us 14-foot tides instead of 8-foot.
The most shocking part of Hurricane Sandy was the fact that it exceeded expectations.
I think the sheer magnitude of it caught a lot of people off guard.
When Hurricane Sandy came, we were not prepared at all. I mean, not even the slightest.
Yeah, it was like an alien invasion of water. And not the good kind of water.
So yeah, I mean, it came right in front where there was literally boats on 14th Street floating in front of our window.
We had a sub-basement level office a block from here, and it was totally covered in water for 2 days, so we lost everything. Everything.
We're really concerned about another storm and the flooding that's possible, and we think that the next time it's going to come even further inland.
I'd like to see some type of flood protection in this area. That's going to happen. We're vulnerable, obviously, being close to the water.
Something that just brings like more walks, different walks of life, you know, another escape from just the busyness and the hustle and bustle.
There's this great space that could really become community space, cultural space, and active uses.
Everyone enjoys space. And in New York and other congested cities, it's hard to come by.
Anything that makes the cities greener is just such a wonderful thing for not only the environment, but the people that live in the city too, to be able to be around that space.
The plans, the berming, the sense of how it can become into the natural landscape itself, how we want to program that is really the next challenge. We are the link, we're the tip in a sense of the big U. It's important that the entire waterfront of Lower Manhattan build in the plans that have been put forward, because we can not only fortify this great city of New York, but be a model for cities all over the world.
Dry line. And I think you have actually right here with the LA River, very, very similar situation where you have a river that likes to flood or that can be quite dangerous when there is a lot of water, and basically also, trying to undo the efforts of the past of actually trying to just put it into a concrete channel and maybe make it a little bit more natural again. So. Every city, whether it's a coastal city or it has a river running through it, has issues of, I think, water and how and our attitudes as designers to that water. The project that we just completed is actually our first project, and it's the VIA housing in New York. And I like to show this because this is like 1930s, 40s New York. When you look at the waterfront, it is just phenomenal what has happened kind of over the last 50 to 60 years. Really, in the last 10 years, what you see is that the entire edge of what was at once commerce-driven and capitalist has turned into actually a green series of parks that goes from Riverside Park to Hudson River Park, to Battery City Park, Battery, and is now through actually the Big U, will be connecting to the East Side River Coastal Resiliency and all the way up. So it's remarkable that the entire edge of the city is going to go through such a massive transformation, not only to, and not to leave out Brooklyn Bridge Park and Governor's Island. I think that landscape architects in many ways are kind of the rock stars of our time, because when you consider that the landscape architects are sort of unlocking all of this incredible public realm, that then architecture's projects are sort of aligning the periphery of these. And when you look at just how much investment the city of New York has put into reclaiming the piers, into creating a very wonderful soft edge to the waterfront, you can kind of understand that when we were thinking of how to design in this area, we have a 1930s power plant to our north, we have a trash distribution center to our south. So basically, we thought that the courtyard in this case of the whole city block was a way to internalize the views, and not to kind of express a tower that looks out, but rather to create something that is very inward looking. Also, we saw it as a possibility for Hudson River Park and the Riverside Park to start to hop over into the grid of Manhattan and start to actually green and create habitat within the city. So the Courtscraper came out of basically going through a series of iterative design where we were looking at the program, the requirements that the client had set out for us, and then sort of within a 2-week process came into the ideas of this courtyard. We had actually initially made it a very sort of mid-rise courtyard and picked up the corner on the water side. The client actually came back, Douglas Durst, and said, "Give me my tower," and so picked up the northeast corner, and thus through this kind of collaborative effort came up to the Via as we know it today. Now, courtyards are nothing new. Courtyards have been around forever, not only in Europe, but also in New York. This is 1929, the London Terrace. It's a full city block, 1,800 apartments. It's 3,500 people live there, so it's like a little small town. And what you have inside is this beautiful, lush courtyard. You live in the middle of Chelsea, middle of the city, and you have this kind of quality. And I know here in, I don't need to speak about courtyards. Melrose Place is from Los Angeles, so you know the virtues of courtyards and of all of the kind of courtyard typologies that were being built. But it's you could say very sad that in New York, with the coming of the Lever House, the Seagram's building, this typology of a tower on a podium kind of wiped out the courtyard typology totally. And when you think of, these first towers were actually built to be office towers, but then they basically also became residential towers. And many of them were just really sealed with very little connection to the outside. So our question was like, what could happen when you kind of combine the typical New York skyscraper with a typical European courtyard? And it was really to create kind of a new species of residential, which is the Courtscraper. So the idea that you could create a dense building in the city and bring daylight into all spaces. What we have here, typically you have a courtyard. The courtyard goes all the way to the ground. And this was also important to protect the views of the building behind, because our client also owned that one. In our case, we take the courtyard from the ground and we actually lift it to the second floor. Thus, we create a full podium, which is very important in New York. And then we lift the northeast corner 44 stories tall, still preserving the views of that tower. And then the sun coming in from the south is able to bring light into the greenery. And so for us, that kind of illustrates how on a building scale, the courtyard is what Central Park is on the city scale. And it's actually proportioned exactly 13,000 times smaller than Central Park. We also wanted to bring certain aspects of Central Park into the landscape design so that you can recreate the meadow and the fountains. So, you know, when you think of, you don't have to be the tallest building on a skyline to actually have an impact. You can have the same density as the tall sliver towers, but do so in a way that I think offers a lot of diversity, and I think also spaces that are much more quality-wise. The construction is concrete. Generally all residential towers are. And you can see through here that, you know, it's a panelized, it has 1,200 unique mega panels that are set in. Enclosed was the subcontractor for that, and then a lot of storefront systems. The actual, this is something also I think very unique to this building are these cockpits, we call them, or terraces, balconies, and you know, you're living basically 37, 40 stories up in the air, and you have the ability to walk outside. You're protected from the wind on 3 sides, and you can enjoy the view. When you walk into the lobby, this is the stair that takes you up to the courtyard. You have views from all of the different balconies, so every unit has a balcony or a terrace. And then when you actually are and inhabit the landscape, it's very lush. You have areas to sit down. There's a little fountain for kids. You walk up, and there's a grilling area to your right, the little mini meadow. And then for many, this is a rental building. So we have, you know, you can play pool, you can swim in the pool, you can enjoy a half-court game of basketball, a poker room and a bridge room, and a library. So there's a lot of different amenity spaces that have to sort of be also worked into these projects. But I think the quality that I really appreciate the most is the units themselves. So this is, you know, one of the units that looks directly out onto the landscape. You're living in Hell's Kitchen next to a 1930s power plant, and your view is out to the landscape. So it's looking at how you can actually make something nice out of a tough situation. So the next project I'd like to show, or I'm going to let Bjarke actually present it, is the Vancouver House.
The Flatiron in downtown Manhattan is an architecture born out of a specific moment in New York real estate history, where skyrocketing land value intersected with the advent of steel structure and elevators and transformed a difficult triangular site into one of the most striking landmarks in New York, becoming the namesake for its entire neighborhood. And for us at Big, this is a perfect example of how we like to work. We like our designs to respond to their surroundings. We like them to inherit their attributes from the challenges and potentials of their environments. Like, for instance, this Courtscraper in Manhattan that combines a courtyard with the density of a skyscraper, creating a warped pyramid on the waterfront of the city. So essentially, our buildings end up looking different purely because they perform differently. Take, for instance, this financial center in Tianjin that inherits its stalagmite silhouette from the structural challenges of building taller than half a kilometer. Or this observation tower in Phoenix that allows the visitors to experience a 3-dimensional 360-degree panorama of the surrounding city, almost like a heavenly body hovering above the desert. And finally, that brings us to Vancouver. The first time I arrived in Vancouver, I drove across the Granville Bridge, and I was struck by the beauty of the urban panorama of the slender glass towers rising against a backdrop of the sea and the mountains. And right here where Granville Bridge triforks, we've been invited to reimagine the gateway to the city. This is already a site in transformation. Granville Bridge is being transformed into this pedestrian parkway, almost like a Canadian cousin to the High Line in New York. And right where this new green promenade touches downtown it's going to create a new urban oasis, which is going to become our new neighborhood. So first of all, we thought, why don't we reimagine the traditional urban podium and turn it into a lively village full of alleyways and plazas for like a dense, lively urban environment of like restaurants and retail underneath a green carpet of grassy roofs and under the canopy of the bridges. And for the tower, there's a general 30-meter setback requirement from all the bridges to ensure that nobody lives too close to the bridge, reducing our tower to this like tall, slender triangle. But also to respect the neighboring park, we had to sort of recede our silhouette to ensure that they get daylight and sunshine, reducing our footprint to only 600 square meters. But then we were thinking, if the 30-meter setback has to do with ensuring a minimum distance, as soon as we rise above and beyond the bridges, we can actually come back out and maximize the areas with the greatest views and the most abundant sunlight. So it almost becomes like this tower turned upside down that actually grows out of a tight spot in a lively city and then expands to occupy the maximum area in the surrounding skyline. In a way, you can see Vancouver House as a contemporary Canadian evolution of the Flatiron that takes the residential high-rise one step further into the future.
So just as basically the Flatiron, in a way is built because of technology that was happening. So you had the advent of the elevator, and you had the advent of sort of reinforced concrete construction and steel. And what this allowed you to do was to basically build more floors and have them accessible. If this was a 5 or 6 story building, it wouldn't really work. But as a 20-story building, it works. And I think that that's also, whenever there's these like leapfrogs of technology within our profession, you have to kind of look back at all the sites that were sort of not really taken advantage of and see if those sites are now suddenly make sort of a sense. And that's what I think the Flatiron really represents, is this kind of celebration of technology. And what the Flatiron is in New York, we hope is the Fat Iron in Vancouver. And so this is now under construction with a completion date sort of in early 18. It's just now popping out of the ground. You've probably noticed that we've gone through a lot of different shades. We're now in green. This is in Copenhagen, and this is an abandoned dry dock north of Copenhagen. That's now the Danish Maritime Museum. So you have a castle right here, which is actually Shakespeare used it as the home base for Hamlet, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. What that means is that you can almost have no new construction within eyesight of the UNESCO Heritage Site. The museum is in this dry dock, so we were really not allowed to even peep up out of the ground. So the tender that we received was, okay, we would like to build a Danish Maritime Museum, so let's pump out this water, fill the hole with the program of the museum, and just cap it. And we thought that that was a very sad kind of way of reading it, because the artifact, the best artifact of the entire shipbuilding industry was the dry dock itself. So we wanted to preserve the dry dock as a kind of fossil for the museum. And so what we came up with was this idea of actually burying or digging out like a donut space around the dry dock, preserving the dry dock as it is, as a public space, and then placing the program around it, and then capping the area around it. Well, we were competing. This is a European competition, so we had 5 other competitors, and they sued the client after we were declared the winner, because they said that if the tender had told them to dig out around the dry dock, they would have done that too. So we were in a conundrum, because we basically had just won our first cultural commission, and the client decided to basically rip up the competition and say, we're not going to declare anyone a winner because they didn't want to get sued. We were devastated. But then 2 weeks later, the client walks into our office and says, I have a new idea. I'd like to do a new museum that you dig around the dry dock, and I think you guys are the perfect to fill it. So you sometimes really have to have clients that have the same kind of creative balls as you do, and cojones. And so, we worked very hard and long on this. This is about a 6 or 7 year process. Remember I said it couldn't stick out of the ground at all, so not even an elevator overrun. So the entrance is actually a gradual ramp that takes you down. Then below these ramps are glass corridors that create sort of short cuts between the different galleries. And then the entire dry dock is open 24/7 for all of the folks in the city to inhabit. And it's been a huge success. It's tripled attendance. Lots of people come to see the exhibits and to experience the spaces. We use chains and had these metal box trusses made in a shipyard, actually. So there's a lot of tectonics also in the building that are very much the way that ships were built. And we thought of a lot of spaces for the kids, actually. We made a reading room that was kid height, and then the exhibition itself that shows a lot of the history. And the space down in the dock is used for performances, dances. Here it's like a little theater festival, or this is like the sort of reverse Titanic moment with Rose right here as you look down into the abyss. Not everything has to be huge or big or new. You can really, like the last project, you can work with things that are there. I mean, this school and this building is a perfect example of sort of breathing new life into old abandoned structures, repurposing them. So one of the smaller projects that we've worked on is Bjarke's math teacher, who then became the principal of his high school, called and said, would you help us? We need to build a handball court. Handball is the national sport of Denmark. That way they ensure themselves an Olympic medal because no one else plays it. It's like a 1950s, it was a U-shaped school, so it had a courtyard. And Bjarke remembers playing in that courtyard and thought it was like horrendous to actually fill the courtyard with a handball court. It would have destroyed the soul of the school. And so he proposed to dig the handball court into the ground. And then as an ode to his math teacher, he actually made the roof of it the formula of the ballistic arch. And basically, you all know form follows function. This is form follows formula. So you actually have this shape that retains the ability to kind of inhabit it all year round. And then underneath it, you have the court. Daylight is streaming in on the sides. And then they liked it so much, they also asked us to build a school building, classrooms. So this is the classrooms, and where concrete is basically the wall surface here, and the wood is basically the roof and the floor. Here, concrete is the floor and becomes the roof, and the wood is the wall. So it kind of flips the material palette from one building into the other. This is the classroom, and then you're looking out to the pregnant bump in the schoolroom. And why the parents of the school love it so much is that during graduation they can actually see their child on the bump, so that all the families are happy. And it really is the sort of place that everybody sort of goes to. The janitor of the school says it's such a huge success. He can tell because there's now 3 times the trash bins in the courtyard than there were before. And then finally, we're now sort of in the coldest regions, and this is a power plant that we're designing. It's a waste-to-energy plant, and Denmark is a tiny country. It has, all the land is basically inhabited or used as agriculture, and so they don't have places to kind of put trash. And what they've been doing since the 1950s is burn trash, incinerate trash, and then create electricity and heat. And we're basically designing the largest, most expensive building in the history of Denmark. So imagine, it's positioned right here. Imagine the waste of 600,000 people going in, and then literally the households of downtown Copenhagen getting their heat and their electricity from it. It is in the center of the city because, of course, the incinerators only make sense if the trash trucks can actually drive there in relative ease or in a short distance. You wouldn't place these on the suburbs or like nuclear plants out in the countryside. So it's a power plant that needs to look good. And so they had basically a competition for architects. Please make this power plant look good. And so I think it's a very interesting kind of thing because engineers are typically hired to do all of these power plants. They somehow lost the aesthetic gene or DNA, and so they call on architects to sort of help out. And 1 ton of trash is equal to 1 2/3 barrels of oil. 1 bag of trash is equal to 4 hours of electricity and heat. And so since we have this sort of mountain of trash, and we're in the flattest country of Europe, but we have actually the climate of Scandinavia, so it snows 3 to 4 months of the year. We decided to graft a ski slope on top of this power plant. And you'd have sort of a black diamond slope, green and blue. And so it's a power plant that you basically use. It's an amenity for the rest of the city. It's a chance to actually, all the dollars, the hundreds of millions of dollars that are invested in our power infrastructure to not have NIMBYs, I don't want that in my backyard, turn into YIMBYs. Like, yes, my children want to play on that heap of trash. And it'll have the tallest climbing wall in the world. You can bring your kids to play and hike up. You can even bring, on date night and take a look at all the spires and church towers of the city. And then inside, we're going to have basically super graphics that literally detail out how the incineration actually happens. So it communicates everything. You'll be walking through this kind of Willy Wonka-esque sort of tour, and you'll basically be able to follow the entire process and then become that much wiser. It's a competition that we won back in 2009, and it is now being built. It's now being realized. And here, this is also something that we are doing, which is we've decided not to just puff out a trail of smoke, but to actually puff out smoke rings. And the smoke rings are there to communicate. Basically, each smoke ring is when 1 ton of carbon is burned in the plant. And think of us kind of as social animals. We exist, and we literally do what we're told. So when you hear the clock strike 3 in a city square, you know it's 3 o'clock. If that clock didn't strike, you wouldn't know what time it was. Here we're saying that if it's a trail of smoke, you have no relationship to that smoke or its contents, or you have no information. So what we're hoping with the smoke rings is to kind of create a communicative tool to say, to your daughter, look, dear, 3 tons of carbon have just been burned in the plant. And then, if it's suddenly 10 rings of carbon, maybe we should reduce our carbon footprint. And then have kind of you can engage and you can start to impact the actual thing. But you, as an architect, you can't just go out and buy a smoke ring or a steam ring generator. These are, it's a little bit, it's a big ask. And so we have developed over the last couple of years a group within BIG called Big Ideas. And these are folks that are architects, scientists, rocket engineers that basically are there to figure out how to do these things that we ask them on some of our projects. So this is a prototype that we did a couple of years ago. We've done 2 more since of actually creating a smoke ring.
Hvor er det vigtigt! Hvor er det vigtigt!
So this is just to say, that's that optimistic message that I want to end on. Make your dreams come true. So thank you very, very much.